So part two of today's show, Sean. So we do RTCF. R stands for recruiting. T refers to the Notre Dame team. And so the topic that we're going to talk about today is something that you brought up to me 2 weeks ago. We were going to talk about it last week, but the Storms decided they wanted to make it to where I couldn't do the show last week. And the topic is this. We've kind of talked about it in other ways, but you look at college football and it's cyclical with top teams. I mean, there's times when certain teams aren't good for a long time, and then they kind of emerge and break out. I mean, there was a period of decades where Ohio State was always a really good team, but they were never a real title contender. You had that couple year stretch under John Cooper, but even then, you always knew they were going to find a way to win. I mean, John Cooper was Clemsoning before Clemsoning became a Clemsoning thing. You know what I mean? Like, they were going to find a way to lose to one of the Michigan schools, right? And then the 1 year he beats Michigan, they lose at home to Michigan State. You know, I mean, it just – but outside of that, they were always a really good team, but they were never like an elite team. They were never Penn State. They were never that. And then all of a sudden, Jim Tressel comes in and changes things. And really, since he's been here, they're just – every year the expectation is that Ohio State's going to have a chance to play for a title. You know, Alabama for a long time. I mean, you had that 1 year under Gene Stallings in 1990. Was it 1992? 91 or 92, where they were really good, but you know, they weren't great before that. They weren't necessarily great after that. They were a good program for a while, but they weren't an elite program. And then all of a sudden, Nick Saban comes in and changes everything. Clemson was a program that hadn't won a title since 1981 under Danny Ford. They had been a good team, but they were never a team where like, hey, Clemson's got screwed out of the title this year. It goes on, and then all of a sudden Dabo comes along and Clemson becomes a thing, and they're talented, but then they get the Orange Bowls, but then they get blown out by West Virginia. They give up 70 in an Orange Bowl to West Virginia, which just negates all the success from the season. And then all of a sudden Dabo starts to turn it around, you know, and Taj Boyd comes in and helps that, and then eventually they kind of get the thing going, and now Clemson for a period of time was considered a team that you look at and say, that's a contender. I mean, every year from 2016 to 2020, every year you thought that Clemson team is going to have a shot to win it all this year. Georgia hadn't won a title since 1980, and then Kirby Smart gets them rolling, right? So you have these cycles, and then those teams fall out of cycles. Clemson right now is kind of out of that cycle a little bit. And so now you look at it, Sean, and you say, okay, what about this Notre Dame 2024 season? Because almost every cycle of success started with a year where they had a lead-in year for it, with a few exceptions. I think Tressel won a title in his first or second year, right? But there wasn't sort of that. Actually, was it his first year or was it his second year? I'm looking that up. That Tressel won the title. It was his second year, wasn't it? Or am I misremembering that? Yeah, it was his second year. But they went 7-5 the year before. So like their kick the door down moment ended with the title. Clemson's did not. Georgia's did not. Alabama's did not, because Alabama had that really good year in 2008 where they were undefeated going into the SEC title game, got beat by Florida, then got beat by Utah. So like they had that year of building to where now you knew that next year Alabama was a team to watch that next season. There have been other years where teams have that great run and then they falter. Oregon in 2014, great team, gets to the national title game, and then after that, under Mark Helfrich, they faltered, and they just weren't that team again, and really still aren't. I mean, they get a lot of hype, but, I mean, they still haven't won a big game. I mean, you look at this past year, yeah, they were the number one seed. They made it to the college football playoff, but then they get blown out in the first round of the playoff, right? I mean, you look at Mark Helfrich, they go 13-2. They make it to the national title game with Marcus Mariota. They drop to 8-4 or 9-4 the next year, and then the year after that they're 4-8, and he's out of a job. I mean, so we saw what Washington did under Chris Peterson in 2016. They had that great run. They go all the way to the college football playoff. They didn't fall off after that. I mean, they were still good, but they were never that good again. They went 10-3 the next year, 10-4 the next year, then 8-5, and then he retires. You know, we saw Michigan State go to the championship in 2015, beat that loaded Ohio State team, or win the Big Ten title, get to the college football playoff, get blown out by Bama, and they haven't been heard from since. Not as any kind of real type of contender. So you have these different directions that teams go when they have seasons like this. TCU, obviously, I think is the most recent. They had that great run in 2022, and they just haven't been able to build on it. They took some big steps back afterwards. So what is it going to be for Notre Dame, Shaun? We say all that to say, what is it going to be for Notre Dame? What will the 24 season be for Notre Dame? And there's several different ways to look at it. We'll get into those, Shaun. But that's where I think that we can look at this team, whatever we think this team is going to be. I do think one thing that we can all agree on with this, Shaun, is that this 25 season is going to be very telling to us about whether Notre Dame is a team that's going to build on what they did last year, or if they just had a flash in the pan season where they took advantage of a year where we have said was a down year across college football. A lot of the top teams weren't as good as they had been in the past. Did Notre Dame take advantage of that? And they're going to kind of fall back to what they've been, good but not elite? Or is this just the beginning of things to come? I know what our opinion, Pete, we all as fans have opinions, but we're going to learn about it. This season to me is going to be very, very telling towards what that's going to be.
And I think, first of all, identify where you are, right? Marcus Freeman said it, be where your feet are planted. He said that recently. And that's where they are in the program. And so one of the things you point to, we can isolate positionally that speaking to Clemson was able to move from a guy in Taj Boyd that was able to get them to a certain point and then stack him with Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence, right? But on the other side, they also were stacking guys up the middle defensively on that defensive line that kind of aided and assisted and supported what they were doing offensively at the quarterback position. You talk about Alabama. You talked about that 2018 and the transition that they went into. We're going to talk about another transition, or I'll bring it up a little later, a transition that impacts Clemson when they were trying to do what they did, but also impacted Georgia when they were trying to do what they did. But to start the conversation, I really want to, and really the team that made me think about this was Georgia and Kirby Smart, right? Because we saw them lose a devastating national championship game to Alabama in overtime that they pretty much control. Well, Notre Dame just lost a devastating national championship game, not in similar fashion as Georgia lost, but you talk to most people inside that building, they came away feeling like we didn't play like ourselves and we gave the game away early.
Whether they were you agree not with, just happy to be there, Shaun.
No, that was not the feeling. And so now moving forward, this is what we want to talk about. What run or what trend are they going to follow? Are they going to follow the one and dones that Bryan brought up, or are they going to start to trend like a Clemson or trend like a Georgia with a small little breakage for a couple of years? Because it's three different ways you can really look at it. And so you look at 2018, Clemson was 11-3 and 12-2 in 2018 and 19 after that national championship. I mean, not Clemson, but Georgia. That was their record in 2 consecutive years. They got to the SEC championship game in both years, but they lost to Alabama, who was a dominant team, and then they lost to that 2019 LSU team, which is an all-time college football team, right? So they still had another level to jump in order to get to the team in 2021 that actually was able to kind of break through and give us the current form of what we know as Clemson football Georgia football from a culture standpoint. So I want to direct it to, I want to use what we just talked about in recruiting in this 26th class to be that class possibly. I want to go ahead and talk about this 2019 Georgia class. This is the class in 2019. Nolan Smith, Travon Walker, Tyreek Stevenson, Nakobe Dean, George Pickens. Of course, they got their quarterback that led them to 2 national championships in Stetson Bennett, and he was thought of as just a guy. Kenny McIntosh, the running back, who was a big-time guy for them, their power running back eventually. That is the core of the guys that were able to break through and be part of that dominant Georgia team that represents what we think they are now. So points to the. Go ahead.
Here's why I want to stick to this class. Here's why. What was that class? 19 class, right? So Georgia won their first title when? 2021.
Is that 21?
21,
20.
because the
Yeah.
COVID year they didn't win it. That was
They
Alabama one.
COVID year, we really don't even count most of the time.
Yeah, but they were juniors. They were juniors. That was the class. What's the class we've pointed to for a long time that once that class became juniors, we're going to find out how good Marcus Freeman's recruiting is. What class is that, Shaun?
23.
It's yeah, exactly. And they are what now?
Juniors.
Yeah. And that's where the Georgia comparison to me is very interesting. And so I think that class is very important, but I also that's also why I look at Clemson, because Clemson had they had their own unique build too. Because I look at it, I'm like, well, Clemson and Georgia are different, because Clemson really had, like, they arrived on a 2-year span. Like, year one, they get there, year two, they win the title. But if you really go back and look at it, they actually kind of grew to that over a course of 3 seasons. And it was really year 4 of that stretch. So after they lose in 2011 in the Fiesta Bowl, it was 12, 13, 14, 15 is when things started to kind of change a little bit, right? 12, you beat LSU in a bowl game in the Peach Bowl. 13, you beat Ohio State in the bowl game in the Orange Bowl. 14, you have the year where Deshaun shows up, and then boom, he kind of gets you over the hump. So there's always been like a 3 or 4 year build for teams, and you kind of saw that with Notre Dame 2 years ago with a 10-3, and then last year the different thing there. But there was that class that you could point to that served as like, that's the group that got them over the top. You look at Notre Dame's 2012 run. It was the 09 class. Now, they were seniors. It was Manti, Tyler Eifert, Zach Martin, Zeke Mata. It was Chris Watt. It was that class that led the way. Now, there were some young guys that helped, some fifth years that helped. There's that one class that is that. And that's what's interesting about this Notre Dame team, Shaun, because it is that 23 class that we're expecting to say, if they're going to be a team that can get to that point, it's going to be that class. Well, who was in that class? Kenny Minchie, who's battling for a starting quarterback job. It's Jeremiah Love, who you're expecting to be your star on offense. It's Jaden Greathouse. It's KK Smith. It's Jordan Faison. It's Sullivan Absher, Charles Jagasol, Drake Bowen, Jaden Osbury, going to be counted on, Bubakar, Armel Mukum, Adon Schuler, and Christian Gray. A big chunk of your football team is made up of that class. That's got to be – we would not be shocked if 3 or 4 of the team captains this season are from that class. And so can this class be the class that leads that? And that's going to tell us, right, Shaun, if Notre Dame can be that team that uses that great run to eventually kick the door down. That's what we're going to learn a lot about this year. And so when I look at it, Shaun, that's one of the first questions is, can this 23 class do for Notre Dame what that 19 class did for Clemson? Or, I mean, for Georgia. That's what I really want to see. And if you also look at it, you could also make that same case about Ohio State. When you look at Ohio State, what was it, their 22 class? 22, 23, 20, no, it'd be the 21 class. Wouldn't it be Ohio State's 21 class? If I'm remembering this correctly. Give me a second, Shaun. I'm gonna look up this class for this past year's team. Their 2021 class, which had JT, Emeka, Goka, Tyleik Williams. 21 class had JT, Emeka, Tyleik Williams, Jordan Hancock, Denzel Burke, Travion Henderson. You had Donovan Jackson. You had Marvin Harrison Jr. kind of helped. Jack Sawyer. Like that, a big chunk of your team, like the stars of your team, came. But
they were seniors, right?
Correct. Right. But it was that class that led the way. For Notre Dame in 12, it was a senior class. For other years, it's a junior class. For Georgia, it was a junior class, but it was still that one class that served as the foundation for that team. And 23 is the one that we've always looked at and said that's going to be telling for us about how good of a recruiter Marcus Freeman is if that class can be as good as they hope, and we hope it is. I think that class is a little bit ahead because that class was forced to step up even sooner than expected because of needs on the team and, of course, injuries and other instances where that class fueled a lot of what you did last year on both sides of the ball. So can they lead the way that Georgia class did? That's one of the first questions we have to look at is if this is going to happen, can that 23 class serve as the foundation for it?
I love looking at this comparison because I think it really points to we don't know. We have to sit back and wait. I think Notre Dame is positioned to elevate itself and improve at the quarterback position moving forward. So you start to lean towards the Clemson model, right? They do have some questions when it comes to the interior of the defensive line. There are some unknowns. It seems like from a size standpoint, they have solved some things, but Notre Dame consistently being in between that 120 to 130 as far as the defense giving up yards per game on the ground, that's not conducive to taking that next step. And so now we talked about the defensive line recruiting in 26 moving forward. It seems like that's something that they have identified and they've decided to plug it, via the transfer portal. And with some of that development from young guys coming back, a Armel Mupum, a Jason Onye. And so we'll see if they can make an impact that way. But for me, like you said, these juniors, who, by the way, were very bold. I remember covering these young men, like a Drake Bowen, like a Christian Gray, like a Don Schuler. They were very bold before they even became part of the program. They were still high school students committed to the program, and they were speaking, we are going to be the group that brings the national championship to Notre Dame. They had that belief amongst themselves. Even though they lost Keon Keeley, even though they lost Peyton Bowen, they never swayed. They never staggered.
That actually, I think, galvanized them even more. Because you talk to Drake. Drake was like,
all the time,
they're going to regret this. They're going to regret that they didn't stay with us because of what we're about to do. It almost like it pissed him off even more. Like, now we really want to go show it because y'all acting like we lost the only dudes that gave us a chance to do anything. I think it even made him solidified that feeling even more is when they lost those guys, Shaun.
Yeah. And so when you think about that and how important that belief is, now the question is, if they had that type of belief before they became freshmen, and the question is, who's going to be the leaders? Okay. All I know is the same kids that believed, if that's going to be your leadership, that's going to become infectious because they believe that they're going to do it. And now the people in the classes behind them are going to be impacted by their leadership because that's what they're stepping into right now. That's the season they're stepping into as juniors. And so even though we don't know who the captains are going to be or who the leadership is, you have to feel good about these young men that always felt like they were going to allow Notre Dame to take that next step because of their class.
Right.
And so you feel absolutely amazing. So the Clemson model is something that I'm leaning towards believing, but there is still a pull that it might be the Georgia model as well. Because like you said, that 2020, you push it out the way.
Right.
It really was, they were chasing Alabama, and then all of a sudden, here comes this anomaly that was 2019 LSU out of nowhere. Like, we didn't expect them. And
Georgia wasn't a title team that year anyway. I mean, they lost 3 games that year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but the chase was Alabama. That was the chase. And now, without question, no one has to guess who Notre Dame is chasing. Marcus Freeman doesn't have to guess it. The fan base doesn't have to guess. Notre Dame is chasing Ohio State. That is the program we're chasing. It's been proven for 3 years in 3 matchups. We got some work to do. But we have some work to do as a program. We can sit here and talk about almost. Georgia said the same thing about Alabama for years. Almost, could have, should have. Until you do it, you haven't done it.
Yeah. Shaun, I look at it when you look at, like I said, the like we were talking about the Clemson and the Georgia models, they all took time to build. The question that I have, so this isn't even like if Notre Dame doesn't win a title in 25, it means Marcus Freeman's not going to be building what they built there. But even in 2018, when that Georgia team had a disappointing, I think it was a disappointing season from the standpoint of, they lost to LSU, they lost to Alabama, but those were 2 really good teams that year, I mean, obviously 2018, Alabama was a playoff team. LSU was a pretty good team. I have some thoughts on that 18 LSU team. And then 19, they went, or 20, or in 2019, they went out and they lost to that really good LSU team. But they also lost at home to a really bad South Carolina team. But that year also beat a good Notre Dame team, beat Florida, beat Auburn. Like, you could tell even in that disappointing season disappointing for them, their disappointing seasons in 18 and 19 finished with them going 11-3 and finishing number 7 in the country, and then going 12-2 and finishing number 4 in the country. It was very clear that they were no longer the team they were before, that they were a contender. And if you were going to beat them, you better have a phenomenal football team, which 18 Alabama had, which 19 LSU had. And then in 2021, Alabama wasn't as good as they had been in the past, and Georgia was able to finally get over that hump and beat them, even though they still lost to them in the SEC title game. And then, of course, in 2022, they were a dominant football team and blew everybody out. So it took some time, but here's the same thing with Clemson. Here's the interesting thing, the interesting dynamic, because none of this is meant to say Notre Dame's going to follow the exact same path Georgia did and win in X year because Georgia won in X year and Clemson won in X year, because all the circumstances are different. Kirby won in his, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20, his 6th season. Marcus Freeman's going into year 4. Dabo won in season 9, I think it was. Jim Harbaugh won in season 9. I mean, every path is different. What the comparison is, however, is how you build your team and how you get there. When you talk about Kirby Smart in the path to get to the title in 21, it resulted in Kirby saying, okay, we are not good enough here. If we're going to beat Bama, we can't just be great on defense. We have to be able to score on offense. And prior to the 2020 season, he went and made a hire that led to that success, in my opinion. And that guy being gone is why I don't think they're suffering from that now. And that was the hire of Todd Monken. The defense was already really good, just like Notre Dame is already really good on defense now. Recruiting was rolling along, bringing in these big name guys, but it was the Todd Monken hire that turned things around. For Dabo, it wasn't an offensive hire, it was a defensive hire. It was Brent Venables, where they could score. I mean, Shaun, they played in an Orange Bowl in 2011 where they scored 33 points and got beat by 37. I think wasn't the final score of that game. I believe it was 70-33 is what I think that game was. I'm pulling up the Clemson season in 2011 right now. But they lost to West Virginia in the bowl game 70-33. I was correct. And what was also true about that season, it was just further evidence that they still could not regularly beat their two rivals. They beat Florida State that year, but then got blown out by South Carolina that year. And so it was really that next year he brings in Brent Venables, and that started to change things. They beat Ohio State in the Orange Bowl that year. Defense still wasn't really that great, but they were getting better. And then 2013, they go out, and they were really good that year. Defense, but still didn't know how to win those big games. The two losses they had that year, Florida State, South Carolina, beat Ohio State in the Orange Bowl. And then sort of that next year, 2015, you started to see the defense get a little bit better. Their losses that year were more about the offense because they had the injuries on offense, and then Deshaun was a freshman and all that. And then 2015, they finally were able to put it all together. And then, of course, the 2016 team is the one that put it all together. 2015, they started to turn the corner. So at some point in time, you had LSU in 2019. What was it about LSU in 2019? Did they just kind of have that magical year because they had to make a change on the coaching staff to get to that point. They had to have a philosophical change with their coach to get to that point. I think that's been true kind of at a lot of these turnarounds or rebirths type of thing. With Notre Dame, I believe that move was already made. And we already started to see some of the fruit of that move. And I think that was the hire of Mike Denbrock. So I think what makes this this more comparable to Georgia is because Georgia had to make that move, and it was year 2 of that move that truly took them over the hump. So, yeah, it was year, what did we say, 5 of Kirby, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 6 of Kirby. But it was year 2 of making that move on the opposite side of the ball that really got them going. You know, and for Dabo, it was really year 4 of making that move that got them rolling, where they hired in Brent Venables. But that's the thing to me is if this is going to be something that they're going to build on, it's going to be about Marcus Freeman making that right move with Mike Denbrock, which we think it was, but then allowing Mike Denbrock to get you out of your comfort zone. Go watch Georgia in 2020 on offense. You could still see, number one, there are 2 problems with 2020's Georgia offense. Number one is a COVID year. So Todd Monken didn't have as much opportunity for install of his offense. Number 2, you could still see Kirby was kind of reining in a little bit, saying we still need to win playing great defense and keeping the score down. 2021, something changed a little bit, especially once they made the change of quarterback. And then, of course, in 2022, I think the best part of their team in 2022 was their offense. In 2021, they had a great elite defense, and their offense kind of did enough. And then in 2022, but you could start to see the light go on a little bit for the offense that year, Shaun. You know, they started to score, 30 plus, 40 plus more regularly. You look at that 2021 Georgia team, they made this change at quarterback. They scored 56, 40, 62, 37, 34, 30. That was against number 11 Kentucky. 34, 43, 41, 56, 45. And then they gave up. They only scored 24 and they lost Alabama. And then they scored 34 against Michigan, 33 against Alabama in the title game. They had to pick 6 to help with that. But their offense started to turn the corner. And then in year 2, the offense really got nasty. And that to me is kind of, that's what I believe that move of Mike Denbrock being brought in could be for Notre Dame, is sort of that's really the key. Because Georgia in 2019, before he made the move, you look at those 3 really good Georgia teams, 17, 18, and 19. They averaged 35.4 points per game in 17, jumped up to 37.89 the next year. Although I think when you look at that schedule, they had some padded numbers against teams that weren't very good, and they couldn't score against the better teams, so they couldn't score against LSU. They scored 66 against UMass, 49 against Middle Tennessee, 45 against Austin Peay. Like it padded their numbers a little bit. 2019, they were down to 30.8 and then took a little small jump up to 32.3. Then they had a big jump up to 38.6, and then all the way up in their repeat year went to 41.1. And you know what didn't change during that period of time, Shaun? Their defense. Their defense was still really good. In 2022, they only gave up 14 points a game. In 2021, they only gave up 10 points a game. In 2020, they gave a COVID year, I don't count. 2019, that defense gave up 12.6 points per game. 2018, that defense gave up 19, partly because of that late game of the year. In 2017, they gave up 16 points a game. They were always pretty darn good on defense. It was the offense that made the jump. And I think that's going to be the key for Notre Dame as well, is they're going to have to get that side of the ball to play championship football. And that's going to include making the right hire, but then letting that hire do what you brought him in here to do. And that's what I think started to the reason that I'm more confident in others that Marcus Freeman is going to make the right decision at quarterback. Again, I admit it. I still got a little bit of that BK PTSD back in here in me. I got to see it. But the reason I'm a little bit more confident is because we already saw him do it. And he did it last year when they started to really loosen things up and let it go a little bit more. And yes, they did it in the regular season against inferior opponents, but they kept that aggressiveness in the postseason. And I think that, to me, Shaun, is why I'm more confident that things are going to start to turn the corner a little bit for Notre Dame, and why I think that's going to be the key towards them actually pulling this off and not making 2024 a one-off where you took advantage of a down year, but the beginning of some things to come.
The turnover differential for a long time has been an indicator for really good teams or championship teams. There is also a huge indicator when it comes to average yards per rush in average yards given up per rush. Most championship teams, even Ohio State, they were 2.4 differential this year. Michigan was sitting around 2.7, if I'm not mistaken. You look at Georgia, going to the what gets you over the hump. Georgia in 2019, that differential was 2.4. When they finally won a championship, that differential went from 2.4 up to 2.7. Why? They increased their passing by 28 yards from 2,000 per game, just 28 yards per game. Just that efficiency allowed the offensive rush to not increase by that much. They only increased from 185 per yards per game on the ground to 191. But the opportunities that it creates, is you can look at those incremental numbers and not think a lot. But what did it create in play calling situations? What did it allow Todd Monken to do with those weapons in that recruiting class that we pointed out? That points out big game opportunities. Really doesn't show up when you're more talented. It shows up when you go up against other talented teams. And now that effectiveness and that efficiency on the defensive side of the ball and the offensive side of the ball is what allows you to become that championship team. And so if you go back and you look and you start looking at the difference on the ground and what you give up and what you're able to do per average, that really indicates if you can get to that 2.5 difference. Notre Dame last year was at 1.9. They rushed for 5.7, but they gave up 3.8. So where are you going to shed this at, right? Because you don't, Notre Dame might get to 6, might get to 5.9. Where is that other 0.3 going to come from? It has to come from that defensive line getting down to at least 3.5, 3.4 per rush. Maybe they can't be as dominant as Alabama and Georgia getting into the 2s. But if they can get that defensive line down to about 3.4, 3.5, if they do that, Notre Dame stays at 5.7, now you at 2.3, right? So really they need to get down to the 3.2, 3.1 range. If Notre Dame can just stay at that 5.7 from an offensive yards per rush offensively, now they've allowed themselves to get over a hump to hit one of those indicators that says you're a championship, national championship football team. So that's one of the numbers that I looked at when I was saying to myself, where did Georgia take the jump? Where did they take the jump? Because it's not going to just jump out at you like a sore thumb. Like, oh man, they increased by like 50 yards per game through the air. No, it was 20, but that 20 means a lot. And then you add to it playmaking ability. Justin Bennett was just a far better playmaker than Jake Fromm, especially in big games and big moments. Like you can't, when you add that to the mix as well, Clemson had playmakers at quarterback. They had guys that were, would you say they were better playmakers, Deshaun and Trevor, than Taj in moments? Because Taj was a very athletic.
No, I think they were. I think it was more about. I think they were more natural passers than Taj. So yeah, in that regard, I mean, Taj was a playmaker. Yeah. It's just Taj couldn't put a team on his shoulders throwing the ball against the better teams. Now, like you look at Taj's numbers, he was very productive as a passer. He had over 11,000 yards and had over 300 yards every year, over 30 touchdowns every year. But I always felt like in some of those bigger games he couldn't do it. But I actually think more for me, Clemson early on was more about, it was the opposite. It was the same argument we're making about the Notre Dame offense, was more about their defense. Is they could score points under Taj. They just couldn't stop anybody from scoring points. And so then that put a lot of pressure on Taj that you had to go and score. And then I think that's why they would tank against Florida State. That's why they would tank against South Carolina, because Taj would put all this pressure on himself that I got to go out there and lead us to 40 points if we're going to have a shot against Florida State. And then he'd make mistakes and you know, you couldn't, I mean, he had Sammy Watkins to throw to. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins. It was the other side of the ball, but it was the same argument though, Shaun. It was the same exact thing you're saying. But even then, Taj was a really good college quarterback, Deshaun and Trevor were generational, which is weird to have them back-to-back, generational quarterbacks, where they could kind of take things to a whole different level. And unlike Taj, who, again, I've said Taj Boyd is one of the most underrated quarterbacks of the last 15 years. And He is the one that actually got things started for Clemson. And then you needed somebody to kind of take that next step, which is what Deshaun and Trevor did. They had better defenses, but they were more against those best teams. They could put the game on their shoulders with their arms and legs in ways that I just don't think Taj could. Taj was an outstanding college quarterback. Those guys were guys that projected to be outstanding NFL quarterbacks also. And I think that's a little bit of the difference. So to your point is he couldn't do it in those big moments the way they could. He couldn't be the playmaker in those big moments the way that you're talking about with like Taj could not play Ohio State with that defense in 19 and do what he did the way that Trevor did. Taj ripped up an Ohio State defense in 2015 or 2013 that was garbage, and that's why that D coordinator got fired. Right? He didn't face that 2019 Ohio State defense. That was a whole different animal. And he didn't have the ability to, in those moments, put that team on his shoulders and say, let's go do this thing. That's the difference. And Clemson needed that, I think. But it wasn't just that, as you and I have talked about. Deshaun doesn't win a title if the defense doesn't get better. When you look at how the defense played in 15 compared to 16, it's night and day in a lot of instances. And then you look at the defense that Trevor had in 2018, night and day. Night and day different. And that to me is it was kind of like the opposite side of the ball of the head coach had to figure it out. Dabo's always had pretty good offenses. Just couldn't stop anybody. And that's kind of but also that quarterback thing it did depth. But I think Clemson could have won a title in 2018 without a generational quarterback. Because of how good they were on defense, and because of you had the Travis Etienne, you had Justin Ross, you had T. Higgins, you had, the tight end Jordan Leggett, you had Hunter Renfrow, you had that defense. They didn't necessarily need Trevor in 18 as much as they needed Deshaun in 16. That doesn't mean that I think Deshaun Watson was a better player than Trevor Lawrence. It's just there was a difference in what they needed him to be in 18. That 18 team was different. That was without question the best team that Dabo had, without question. Like that 2018 team could have played with 2019 LSU. Would have looked a whole lot different than what it looked like in 2018, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, but that for me, I think the two models to look at would be the Clemson model and the Georgia model of what is expected in the future. I do think the outcome is going to be the same. Notre Dame wins a national championship. When it happens, we'll wait and see. There is definitely signs that dynamic quarterback play is on the horizon. Will it be generational and stacked like Clemson has? Right. Like you said, that doesn't happen a lot.
That's why I love the Georgia model that you keep. I keep wanting to. When we were talking, I kept wanting to talk about Clemson because I've just always compared Clemson to Notre Dame because I think of the way they recruited and some different things. But to your point, the way the team is built, it's much more like the Georgia model, which is kind of what you're talking about, which is great defense, and you got to build around the quarterback, and then the quarterback's got to play at a high level. It's kind of how Ohio State was in the playoff this year. Their quarterback played like an elite quarterback, but he's not an elite quarterback. But he looked like one because good system, but then he had great players around him. The O-line played well. The running backs were outstanding. The receivers were elite. The defense was elite. And then that made him look elite, where Clemson in 16 needed an elite quarterback to elevate everybody else. And, of course, he had great weapons to throw to. Mike Williams doesn't suck. But to your point, that's the thing is you can win with a Stetson Bennett at Notre Dame. You look at J.J. McCarthy and what Michigan did with him at quarterback. You look at Ohio State this year with Will Howard. In the last the last national title championship quarterbacks are Will Howard, J.J. McCarthy, who was a first-round draft pick, but I think there's a lot of Viking fans that are thinking he might be something that we didn't he might be not what we thought he was. And then you had Stetson Bennett, Mac Jones. So last four national championship quarterbacks weren't exactly Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson and Joe Burrow and Jameis Winston and Cam Newton. But what they had around it was really, really good. And so for me, Notre Dame needs both. I do think Notre Dame needs a difference maker at quarterback, but they need to surround that difference maker quarterback with a better supporting cast than maybe what Riley Leonard had this year.
Yeah, man, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. But I think that's something that has been very evident offensively before Marcus Freeman even arrived or took the job as head coach. I think that quarterback wide receiver combination and question and dynamic offense returning to Notre Dame has been an issue for a long time. And, the same thing we hear about Marcus Freeman, whether it's, putting handcuffs on the offense and all. Kirby heard the same thing until he got somebody he could trust. Until he got somebody he could trust.
How do you hire all same stuff? Same stuff. Mm-hmm. Can't win this way. You got to be able to throw the ball. Same stuff. He won throwing for 250 a game. That's it. Just 250 a game. He was able to win back-to-back national championships. That's it. And the Notre Dame fans would have loved to see 250 a game last year. Yeah. Well, they might have won a title this year if they were averaging 250 yards a game.
Heck yeah. No one comes close to Notre Dame this past year if they were throwing for 250 a game.
The second title team passed for almost 300, right? I mean, so it got better.
That's the bar, yeah.
But here's the thing: they needed that team to be more explosive offensively because if you think of how much they lost from that defense from the year before. So even though the defense was still pretty good, they needed that offense to take that next step, Shaun. So to your point is but even then, your offense still had at times in 2021 had to step up and help you. But let's be real, they won that title that year because of their defense. Because their defense was really good, and it took a lot of that pressure off of their offense. And the defense had one bad game all year. They gave up 41 to Alabama. Outside of that, they gave up 3, 7, 13, 0, 0, 10, 13, 7, 6, 17, 7, 0, 11, and 18. So to me, Notre Dame, I don't know that Notre Dame's going to be able to always count on that. 21, they gave up 22 to Kent State, 22 to Missouri, 20 to Florida, 30 to LSU, 41 to Ohio State. That's more realistic to what I think to kind of go on a run is. You need a big time defense, but you got to have an offense that can also go out there and outscore people for you. And that's what Notre Dame did not have this year. Because when your defense struggled in the first 2.5 quarters against Ohio State, your offense kept giving them the ball back. Your defense is I don't care how good your defense is going to have moments like that. And your offense wasn't good enough to get it done for you. And that goes back to the same story we've always said. Oh, the defense lost in that game. Well, they scored 7 points in the first 2.5 quarters. This wasn't a defensive loss. This was a team loss, but your defense had carried you. You needed your offense to step up and say, hey, we got your back. Until you figure it out, we got your back, and they couldn't do it. And that's whereas the other, Georgia could not stop Ohio State in 2021 defensively. Or 2022, excuse me. Could not stop them. Had no chance. Their offense had to step up and say, we got you. And they did.
But, I mean, in that same season, they couldn't stop Tennessee and Hendon Hooker early in that matchup with Tennessee. And it's eventually they figured out how to get a stop or two, and their offense took over from there, which is a far departure from who they were the year before, which speaks to when you really truly become elite, you become amoeba-like as a program. You have the wherewithal because now you believe and you know how to win, that if it goes back and forth, it fluctuates between both sides of the ball to say, okay, you guys need to step up. Our identity is – go ahead.
It was actually the 21 year that Tennessee moved the ball on them.
Yeah.
To your point, Shaun, the year that they won with defense, Tennessee came out and scored in their first 2 drives. They scored 2 of their first 3 drives. They scored a touchdown on the opening drive of the game. Went right down the field, 10 plays, 77-yard touchdown. Just like butter. Boom, 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 boom. Remember that? Then what did Georgia's offense do? They went right back down the field, 6 plays, 78-yard touchdown. Then Tennessee gets a field goal. They trade punts, and then Georgia goes and kicks a field goal to tie it, and then their offense took over with back-to-back touchdown drives. They get the ball back with about 3.5 left in the second quarter, up 17-10. If you're Tennessee, you're feeling really good about it. Like, look, we've weathered the storm. We're down a touchdown. We're going to make some adjustments to get back in it. And the Georgia offense goes right down the field in 3 minutes, and James Cook scores on a touchdown reception, 11 plays, 90 yards. And at that point in time, you're down by 2 touchdowns to Georgia at halftime in 2021. You're done. You're done. You're cooked. Right? So to your point, Shaun, you're making the point. That was one of those games where early on, Hendon Hooker was doing his thing, and you had to figure out some answers. The defense eventually figured it out, but the offense kept them in the game in the meantime. And that's what Notre Dame's offense couldn't do this year, and what they're going to have to do in the future if they're going to be that kind of team that can turn the corner. And that's where the Denbrock hire was so huge for Notre Dame.
They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it against Ohio State because there's levels to this, right? The defense dominated and pretty much set the tone against Indiana and Georgia. They couldn't do it against Penn State, and the offense answered the bell. The offense answered the bell against Penn State, but the dynamic offense and the difference between Penn State's offense, Penn State could not have the same opportunities early to create a really big gap between them and Notre Dame, but they failed to do so because of mistakes. And Notre Dame was still in it. So that when Notre Dame hit the gas offensively, they were able to get back in the game and eventually win. That valley that Ohio State with their dynamic offense was able to take advantage of the Notre Dame offense getting off to a slow start, similar in the Penn State game, they couldn't come back. It was too much for them to come back, right? So that is, Notre Dame was able to answer the bell offensively against Penn State, and then against Ohio State, it was just too much. It was just too much. And so now you want that team. So it seems like they were able, same thing against USC. Like, okay, offense, we're not having a good day defensively. USC has figured some things out. Right. They're hitting some big plays on us in the passing game. You guys have to go ahead and stretch this thing out. They were able to do that, and then the Notre Dame defense was able to close late in the game, similar to what they did against Penn State. And so Notre Dame has that. You see the beginnings of that to where it's both sides of the ball can play off each other and rise up at certain times of the game. But now that offense has to take that next step to really be able to do it against the best of the best. Like,
but you don't do that if you don't make the right hire, Shaun. That's the thing. That's why, Jim, you could say that about Jim Chaney in 16, 17, 18, 19. That was always true of the Georgia offense, but they couldn't do it because they didn't have the guy, in position to have that success. Now they do. He's now got to take that step, and then it's up to Marcus Freeman to make sure that he has the freedom and the resources to then build the offense to be as special as the defense is. Those are the things that I'm looking for here, Shaun, to get to the point where Notre Dame can kind of say, hey, look, this is where we're going to go with this thing. And that's what we're going to find out.
The nuance of this, like we said, Georgia really increased. They went from 223 to 251. That first championship, and then they took a huge jump from 251 to almost 300. What was the biggest factor in both years in making that jump? We know Todd Monken. We know it was his second year. So then you see it take an even greater jump. But was it more about Stetson Bennett and his maturation, or was it really about the weapons? They had a dude wearing number 19 that was, we need a big play. We're going to him. Similar to Ohio State. We need a big play. We're going 4. Yeah. Right. And so that begs the question, is moving forward, is Notre Dame going to be able to find that guy? Is Malachi Fields going to be that guy?
I think the thing is you need that dude to kind of go to. There's several factors that go to it for me, Shaun. Number one is, I think Georgia was more willing to open it up in 2022 because they knew they couldn't just they knew they were going to be really good in 22 on defense, but not the elite defense they were in 2021. So you kind of had it open up a little bit, number one. Number two, I think the pressure was off too. Like, you just won the title. There's not as much pressure on you now. Like, hey, let's go out. Now we're the big dog. And then I think the third thing is obviously Stetson Bennett had a whole year starting under his belt. Because remember, he didn't start 21 as a starting quarterback. JT Daniels started that season at quarterback. And then Stetson kind of eventually get there because you started to see it a little bit, Shaun, even in 2021, you started to see it late in the year. You know, like you look at the average and you say, well, they averaged only 251.9 in 2021, but you saw flashes of it. I mean, you had let me pull up Stetson from that season when you look at kind of some things he did, but he throws for 288 against UAB, and then JT throws for a bunch against South Carolina. Stetson goes 14 of 20 for 250 yards, 3 touchdowns against South Carolina. Goes 13 of 19 for 255 against Missouri. But they were beating these teams so bad that they didn't necessarily have to throw a whole lot. Part of the reason their numbers were down a little bit is because, you had some games where they didn't throw a ton. Well, you could argue that's the same thing is true in 2022. But you look at the 340 in the SEC title game. He throws for 313, goes 20 to 30 for 313 yards and 3 touchdowns against Michigan. And so I think you started to see it a little bit where the longer he was in the system, the more comfortable he was. And then he come out in 2022, now that he's got more experience, and then right out of the gate, 368 against Oregon, 284 against South Carolina, 312 against Missouri, 289 against Vandy, 316 against Florida, 257 on only 25 attempts against Tennessee, 289 against Mississippi State, 274 against LSU in the SEC title game, 398 against Ohio State, 304 against TCU. He didn't play the fourth quarter of that game. So I think the pressure came off. But the other part of it, too, is you also had Brock Bowers was now a sophomore, so he had now a full year of experience under his belt. He was a year older. I think, having sort of the complementary weapons in 2021, I think one of the differences that I felt from 20 to 2021 is I just like the pass catchers better. Georgia in 2020 had talented guys. You had George Pickens, you had Jermaine Burton, you had Kears Jackson. They were nice players, but they weren't quite that dominant group of players. Well, in 2021, you're supposed to have Brock Bowers, Jermaine Burton, Ladd McConkey was a freshman, A.D. Mitchell was a freshman. You were kind of young there. Brock Bowers was a freshman, Jermaine Burton was a sophomore, and you were supposed to have George Pickens, who was supposed to be a dude. Well, George Pickens gets hurt and only plays 4 games, plays the last 4 games of the year, and only catches 4 passes. I think George Pickens getting hurt and all those young players. So now you go into the next year, Brock's a sophomore with tons of experience. Ladd McConkey's now a sophomore with tons of experience. You've got some of these older players. And then Kears Jackson, who was your leading receiver in 2020, is now your 6th leading receiver in 2021. And you were able to overcome A.D. Mitchell getting hurt that year because you now had multiple dynamic weapons. Your number 2 tight end that year had 28 catches for 454 yards in Darnell Washington, if you remember how good he was. So I just think the experience of quarterback, you were now in year 3 of Todd Monken's system. That factors in 2. Your young players in 2021 are now a lot like we talked about Notre Dame players. Yeah, Notre Dame's a young team this year, but all those young kids played a ton of football last year. Yeah, Leonard Moore's only a sophomore, and Bryce Young's only a sophomore, and Kingston's only a sophomore. They played a ton of football last year. Yeah, I know Drake's only a junior and started for 1 year, and Adon's only a 1-year starter, but they played a ton of football last year because of the long season. And I think that all of it kind of it's never often one thing, Shaun. It's like it's a factor of things. And I think that's kind of what did it for Georgia is that. And that's why, will 25 be that year for Notre Dame, or will it be the year where their quarterback has to have a year under his belt? Like that, somebody mentioned that in the chat. I think it might have actually been Insured by Big, where he talked about, look, 25 y'all are going to be really good, but 26 the years to watch because you're going to have year 2 of a quarterback. It could be that. But my point is whether they win it all or not this year, how they perform, meaning staying on that level as a team, and then starting to make more strides on offense is going to be the thing that tells us if this team is truly about to kick down the door. And that's why I don't think a title needs to happen in 25 for this to be true, for us to feel like, right? It just has to be that thing that kind of says, hey, let's kick down that door. We are that team. We are that program. Let's go do it. And I think for a lot of those teams, you look at it, it was a process to get to that team that won the title. How many disappointments did that great senior class in Ohio State have to go through before they finally figured out how to get the thing done?
Yeah, because one thing that doesn't change regardless, Brian, is the purpose, right? I mean, we know, we are believers. So, it's real to us when we read all good things come together to the good of them that love and are called according to his purpose, right? Like, we believe that. But from a football standpoint, what you're explaining is in order for that to take a jump, it's a lot of factors, right? You go back to 24, like, it was not just one area to point to. Like, you can point at the quarterback, wide receivers, offensive line, tight end, everybody. Like, it wasn't working together. So it wasn't good, or it wasn't good enough. All right. And so now this is what we're talking. At some point, it's going to work together. All things are going to work together to lead to that purpose of an international championship, right? And so will it be 25? We don't know. Will it be 26? We don't know. But we believe that we're starting to see the offensive line come together, right? We start to see the running backs that have always been there and that are going to continue to be there. We feel like there are a lot of good things in the current wide receiver room that can come together this year. And we'll see how recruiting in 26 and 27 tries to continue that trend. But this is what we're talking about. Things are starting to come together offensively, and Mike Denbrock being at the helm of everything and Marcus Freeman trusting him or entrusting him with that, you start to feel good that eventually, that national championship is in the near future. But it's just a great discussion to really have. Like, when it's going to be, what model is it going to be after? Is it going to be Clemson? Is it going to be Georgia? We don't have or don't foresee a COVID year, that Georgia had to weather that pushed them back. Maybe they win in 20 if they have a full offseason, full year.
Maybe
they do, maybe they don't. So, it's going to be very interesting. I tell people all the time, will the Notre Dame quarterbacks be 220 yard per game guys as first-time starters, or will they be 250 yard per game guys?
But I think what you're saying is why I don't think Georgia would have won in 2020. Like, there's no way Georgia's going to be able to score with Alabama in 2020 when their best receivers are Kyrus Jackson and Jermaine Burton. Yeah. Like that's my point. Even though it was before JT Daniels had his injuries and all that kind of stuff, like, they get into a game against Georgia in 2020, Shaun, in that first year of Todd Monken's tenure. I don't care how good Todd Monken was. Number one, it was your first year in that tenure. Number two,
awesome coordinator.
Yeah, you weren't going to be able to stay up with that team. You couldn't put it all together. Now, you started to see flashes late in the year, right? I mean, last 3 games, they went 7.6 per play on 4 state. Last 3 games of the year, they scored 45 points against South Carolina, 49 against Missouri. They scored 24 against Marcus Freeman's defense at Cincinnati, but they still averaged 7.1 yards per play, had 449 yards of offense. They had 615 against South Carolina, 8.4 per play. So you started to see it kind of take off a little bit, but they had no balance. 332 for 130, 332 rushing, 139 passing in South Carolina. Missouri, you saw a great balance. They were 316 for 299. They had balance against Tennessee that year. It wasn't very good. 193, 238. They had balance against Auburn that year, 202, 240. But then they had a lot of games like this. Then the loss to Alabama, 145 rushing, 269 passing. And the loss to in the win over Mississippi State, which was an ugly win, 1 touchdown win, 8 rushing yards, 401 yards. Against South Carolina, they could run the ball, couldn't throw the ball. Against Cincinnati, they threw the ball all over Cincinnati, but couldn't run the ball on Cincinnati. They ran for 45 yards in that game, threw for 404. The next year, I felt like they were a more balanced football team. And I think that was a byproduct of a lot of different factors. But it was mainly a byproduct of the fact that their talent was getting better. They were recruiting better on offense, but they had someone that could put the talent they had in position to be successful. But you can't say it wasn't recruiting and I'm not saying you aren't, I'm just saying in general, Shaun, you can't say that recruiting didn't have a big impact on that, because you didn't have Brock Bowers in 2020 and you did have Brock Bowers in 2021. And you didn't have, you had Ladd McConkey on the team in 2020. but he was a redshirt. He was a true freshman that was part of that whole COVID class that couldn't practice and all that kind of stuff. George Pickens was never healthy in his college career. But you go out and you have Ladd McConkey. You go out and then you have Brock Bowers. You go out and you go get A.D. Mitchell. And all of a sudden, you get these really talented players that you didn't have on your first couple teams because A.D. Mitchell was a true freshman in 2021 as well. And 3 of your 4 best pass catchers are true freshmen and redshirt freshmen who didn't play the year before. And then you had Jermaine Burton, who was, I think, a redshirt sophomore.
That's another dynamic you're talking about. Yeah, you're recruiting talent, but it goes back to the conversation we had with recruiting. Opportunity is not just, man, we're going to put you out there in the field. Are you ready? You talk about A.D. Mitchell, playoffs against Michigan, making plays. Right?
Yeah.
Championship game, making plays. You talk about that Ohio State game, a guy that Notre Dame fans laughed at this year in the matchup with Georgia. Well, who did they go to for a big play in the fourth quarter? That same guy that struggled catching the ball. He was a youngster. He got his opportunity. He made the big play for the big touchdown that really turned the tide of that game and got Georgia back in it. So this is what you create. Offensively, you don't know where it's going to come from. But you have that guy. Right? Georgia could hit you with multiple guys, like you said. They had other guys in the passing game that could make plays, and then they had a guy in Brock Bowers that when it got tight on a 4th down late in that game against Ohio State, everybody in the stadium knows who they're going to. Ohio State knows. He gets hit 2 yards before the first down, and he finds a way. He makes the play. And so that is the dynamic of everything coming together to be able to get the job done offensively. And that is the challenge for Mike Denbrock. And I'm glad he spoke about the wide receivers. I'm sure. But like I said, I believe, in my opinion, he used that message to the wide receivers to speak to everyone on the offensive side of the ball. Like, hey, this is going to be the standard.
Right.
For all of us. In order for us to do what we need to do, every position room needs to be fundamentally, job sound, no mistakes, consistently. This is we have to be where we need to be and do what we need to do in every area for us to take the jump that we need to take.
Because you're not going to have a quarterback in 2025, Shaun, that can just put the team on his shoulders week after week the way that Riley did the second half of the year. You're just not. You and I both think CJ and Kenny both have a chance to be special players. I don't know how many times I need to say it. I know who I think is the best quarterback on this team. I've said before, I think it's CJ Carr. I've also said if Kenny wins the job, let's roll. Let's do this. Because he's another guy that has big-time talent and big-time potential. But you're not asking those guys to put the team on their shoulders and carry them the way that you asked Riley Leonard to in 2024. You can't. It's not going to work. They need to be parts. This is the one thing Brian Kelly said well about the 2012 team is Everett Golson's not driving this bus. He's in the passenger seat. Now, sometimes Everett had to step up and make some plays. I think of the go ball or the post route that he threw off play action to Chris Brown in 2012 after Oklahoma just tied the ball game up. Yeah, you had to make some plays. You had to make some. The back shoulder throw he made to Tyler Eifert for a touchdown. I think it tied the game or gave them a lead against Stanford. That takes a special talent to make that throw and make that catch. We've seen it at different times. There was times in 2015 that DeShone Kizer had to step up and make some big-time throws and some big-time – but more often than not, when you started asking more of DeShone in 2015, late in the year, what started happening? You start turning the ball over more. They start struggling in the red zone. They play like garbage against Boston College. They play like garbage against Wake Forest. They should have blown Temple out, but they needed a fourth quarter comeback win. Why? Because you threw 2 red zone interceptions in that game. You beat a really bad BC team, 19-16. Why? Because you turned the ball over 4 times in the red zone that year. Like, you can't ask that type of quarterback to be that guy week after week after week after week, and they are not going to ask either one of those guys. So the talent around them, to your point, has to step up. Well, the running backs can only do so much. You need the tight ends. You need the receivers to raise their level of play to get to that point, because Mike Denbrock knows what a big-time football team looks like. He knows what a championship team football team looks like, not just because of the teams he's been on, but the teams he's coached against. He coached against 2012 Alabama when he was at Notre Dame. He coached against 2015 Clemson when he was at Notre Dame. He coached against 2015 Ohio State when he was at Notre Dame. He coached against Alabama 3 times when he was at LSU, or twice when he was at LSU, including a win over Alabama. And he coached against Georgia those 2 years. He was the OC in 2022 for the Georgia team that smoked LSU. He knows what a championship team football team looks like. And he knows it's not about just putting CJ and Kenny in there and saying, go be stars. They have to do that at some point in time. But you're not a star without, I mean, Joe Burrow was a stud, absolute stud. Does he win a title if he's throwing to average receivers and not Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson? No, he doesn't. You put him on South Carolina's football team that year, they're better than they were. They're not playing for the title. You put them in Arkansas that year, they're a lot better than they were. They're not playing for a title. It's about all of it, the whole package. And that's the point, Shaun, is you've got to have those dudes around them. And there needs to be, and what I loved about that comment and other comments he's made about the offensive line over the last year is he's basically said, look, there's a standard here, and I expect everybody to live up to it. Everybody to live up to it. You have to be smart about when you do and don't say it. And that's why I think the spring is the best time to deliver some of those messages, because you don't have a game you don't want to lay that message out on the team when they're about to play a game on a Saturday. Now's a great time to do that. And that's what makes it fun. So I think the pieces are in place for this Notre Dame football team. Now it's about Marcus Freeman to push the right buttons. And then the final piece that you talk about potential stumbling blocks, it comes down to when I look at Marcus Freeman, the reality is you've got to be able to push the right buttons. If you can't, this team won't get to where it needs to get to. And this is true it was true for Kirby Smart. It was true for Dabo. Pushing the right buttons means motivating your team properly year after year, setting a standard and holding people accountable to that standard throughout your program. It comes down to when guys do a phenomenal job for you and they depart, you've got to make sure you make great hires to replace them. That's going to be a big part. And then also being able to hold true to your mantra of challenge everything. Because just because you went for it, like the biggest difference, you want to talk about what's the difference between like a guy like Brian Kelly and some other top coaches? Is when Brian Kelly goes 10-3 in 2015 and they barely lose to Clemson, barely lose to Stanford, and then lose. He goes, hey, look, we were X number of points away from being undefeated. We just got to coach a little harder and play a little better. And he made no staff changes that offseason. None. And then the next year they went out and it was a disaster because he didn't have the players to bail him out the way they did in 2015. And you got to say, look, yeah, we went 14-2, and let's say this year Notre Dame goes. Let's say that Notre Dame goes 13-2 this year, or 14-2 again, and they lose again in the title game. And you say, okay, hey, look, we're close. We just got to coach a little better and play a little harder, or coach a little harder and play a little better, whatever. And you're not going to say, well, why we would have beat them if not for all these injuries again. Okay, well, are you going to finally examine why you have those injuries? Or we could have beat them if we would have just been a little better. Okay, are you going to examine why you're not better on that side of the ball? Or, hey, our offense was good, but our defense took a step back. Are you going to be willing to examine why you weren't there? Those are the things that I look at Shaun, and say he's got to be able to do those things. I'm not saying he won't or can't. I'm saying those are when I was with Vince on set, I called him Trev.
Bro, when I'm
doing shows with Trev, I call him Vince or Shaun. It's ridiculous.
You literally could have played a drinking game on the show Saturday every time Brian called Vince Trev.
Yes, you could have been pretty hammered.
And everybody would have been hammered.
You'd have been really hammered by the end of the show. But the point is, he's got to be able to push those buttons as the program evolves. And that's what I think, that's what I give Kirby a lot of credit for in that moment of saying, hey, look, this is my guy. Jim Chaney was his guy. They'd known each other for a long time. To be able to make that kind of move to not only get rid of him, someone who you value, but then bring in a guy like Todd Monken, whose entire philosophy is completely against what you've been. That says, hey, this is what's needed for us to get to that point. Now, I think he backslid a little bit, and we'll talk about that in the next section but yeah, I mean, I look at it and say that's going to be the thing that could potentially be a stumbling block for Notre Dame. The only other one is that the administration stops doing what they're doing now, which is supporting the team financially. Right now, Notre Dame is doing their part as an institution for the football program. if that changes someday, that could be another stumbling block. But it really just comes down to now, Shaun, is Marcus Freeman's willingness to remain focused on the most important things. Like, look, you're a star now. You're the big name guy. You're the guy everybody wants to hear from. And that's totally fine. Do what you got to do, but don't lose sight of what got you to that point. And that's what happens to some coaches when they have that moment and they become flashes in the pan, or it can happen to players too. Like, hey, I had to work my butt off. The reason Kurt Warner was able to have a long career is because he didn't allow that 1 year of success to say, hey, I've arrived. I don't have to keep working as hard and having the attitude I had that got me here. He stayed hungry and kept working and those type of things. And all that throughout the entire program, but at Marcus Freeman at the top, that's going to be the key for him. I'm not saying he won't do it. I'm just saying you have to now prove that you're not going to allow those things to distract you from what's most important. Being the guy that, that your players bought in so much to in the past. You got to be there. You got to be around for them to do that. And that's going to be to me, the potential stumbling blocks for him as they keep rolling.
And that's interesting that you say that, because to kind of close this out, to really, if you're a betting person, you can have this discussion, but just to really look at what we mentioned earlier, who is Notre Dame chasing? And we talked about this. Clemson, I respect a lot because they were chasing different variances of Alabama. Like, they lost to a very run-centric, Derrick Henry-led. I think, didn't Derrick Henry win the Heisman that year? Like, that's the first time they got a chance.
He beat out Christian McCaffrey, who had over 3,000 yards of offense. That's how good he was that year. So,
and then the very next year, now they're chasing a more evolved Alabama.
You went from Jacob Coker to Jalen Hurts.
Jalen Hurts now, right? And so Jalen Hurts is a first-time starter, but like you said, this plays into Notre Dame. Will Notre Dame be dynamic enough around whomever the starting quarterback is to allow them to make that necessary jump?
Don't forget 2018 Tua. Absolutely. He literally had to face 4 different versions of Alabama. This 2017 Alabama team that they lost to was also a very different Alabama team. That looked a lot more like one of the old school Alabama teams that you just couldn't move the ball on.
So they called Alabama kind of like in a shift and at the start of an ascension offensively that culminated in that 2020 all-time offense. Like, they called Alabama kind of like at the bottom of that uptick and got them in a couple of national championship games. And then once they got to the ascension, like, Clemson then started kind of like their downturn.
Right.
And then Alabama had to, the next challenge came from Georgia for Alabama. As they started to trend down, Georgia caught them coming down. Right. And now Bama's going through another shift. Will they be a challenger to Georgia? Who else in the SEC is going to be a challenger to Georgia? Because we're going to talk who we think Georgia is coming up in the next segment. They still might end up in a similar situation, even though we think they're this type of team. So Notre Dame now.
Can we be honest about something, Shaun? Can we just side note?
Yeah.
Can we be honest that if it's not for Clemson, that Alabama has at least 2 more titles? If it's not for Clemson, nobody was beating Alabama in 2016, and nobody was going to beat Alabama in 2018. Meaning, like, nobody. Kyler Murray and that elite Oklahoma team in 2018 had no chance against Alabama. No chance.
No.
I think Notre Dame is the only other team that had a shot against Alabama, but I don't think they'd have beat Alabama as they were currently constructed, because I don't think they could have scored enough. Same problem they had against Clemson. They scored more than 3 because that Alabama defense wasn't as good as the Clemson defense, but they would have had to win in a shootout.
Yeah.
And so my point being, like, you were going against a juggernaut and had to go against that. You had to take down a juggernaut to become that program. Georgia had to do the same thing. And that's where Notre Dame is like, there are some big time programs that are rolling right now that you're going to have to knock off the pedestal. You kind of did one already. Now you've got another one that you got to chase. And that's
so where do you think Ohio State is? Because this is something else. If you remember that first matchup, Nick Saban was like, I can't stop them. I finally faced somebody I can't stop defensively. So now it's like, that was like his eye opener. Like, okay, now my offense has to go to another level in the passing game moving forward. What did Marcus Freeman pull from that Ohio State loss that Nick Saban kind of pulled, or even Dabo pulled from that matchup where Dabo came up short? Nick said, yo, in order for this to keep going, my quarterback has to go to another level. My wide receivers have to go to another level. What do you think is the one thing Marcus Freeman is? Dude, like you said, you told me you've been hearing he's in a bad mood.
Oh, dude.
Yeah, you've been hearing he's in a bad mood.
He's still in a bad mood. Been that way since January.
And Notre Dame fans should love to hear that. Like, you should love to hear that. But what do you think, as we kind of wrap this up, the chase is Ohio State? 2 questions. Where is Ohio State in comparison to where Alabama was? And then are they trending upward, or was that peak for them? And now they're going to start to come down because they have a first-time starter as well.
Ohio State's still Ohio State. I mean, will they be as good this year as they were last year? Maybe not. It's no different than Alabama wasn't as good in 16 as they were in 15. Alabama in 17 wasn't as good as they were in 18. They just happened to play a team that they matched up perfectly against in Georgia in the title game, and so they got that W. But they may take a small step back as a team. They may have a very similar record, though, because of how disappointing their second loss was in the regular season this year. I mean, there's a scenario where Ohio State could have a better regular season record this year than they did last year because of the way their schedule's constructed. But they won't be as good of a team as they were last year.
And this
in the playoffs.
This is interesting too. The landscape, Notre Dame might be hypothetically a better team in 26 for most people, but the landscape to win a national championship might be easier this year.
25.
Because
and you look
at
at
25
schedule in 26 as well.
Schedule and look at the top teams, except for Penn State, most of them will have first-time starters.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. You say, oh, Notre Dame's going to have a more experienced at quarterback that year. Well, so will Ohio State.
So will Ohio State. Texas.
Exactly.
The only team that has a guy coming back.
Going into his second year at Oregon and starter. I mean, it's going to be true for everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, 100% correct, Shaun.
Yeah.
Ohio State, I mean, look, for me, I think the thing, what did he learn? What's the takeaway? I don't know. We're going to find that out. What I think he learned, based on some of the things we saw in the portal, is that you have to be willing to be more explosive offensively in all phases of the game. Look, I'm all for. I don't want to turn the ball over a bunch. I will never want Notre Dame to look like Clemson did in 2016. I think that was a unicorn season in which Bama was starting a true freshman at quarterback. You still needed a last-second game to beat them. And you had a generational talent at quarterback that could overcome those mistakes in a way that other quarterbacks just aren't going to be able to do. They're just not. I mean, if Kenny Minchie is the starter or C.J. Carr is the starter and they throw 17 picks this year, Notre Dame's not going to be very good. Deshaun threw 17 picks that year and they won a title. It's like saying, well, let's be like Michigan 23. That's an anomaly season. That's not the recipe for winning year after year after year after year. And so I think look, you don't need a Jeremiah Smith because there aren't many Jeremiah Smiths out there. You don't have to be a team that throws the ball for 350 yards a game. I don't need them to be that, but you have to be a more effective team in all phases of the game on offense if you're going to win a championship. And I think and honestly, Shaun, I honestly think the second half of that game is more eye-opening for Marcus Freeman than anything. I think what you saw in the second half of that game is, hey, we got some weapons now. We just got to do a better job of getting them the football and doing some things in that regard, and we got to do a better job protecting them. So my takeaway, I hope, is that, hey, you don't have to go full air raid throw for 350 to be a team that values the ability to throw the football more effectively. And I don't think Mike Denbrock's a guy that cares about throwing the ball 50 times a game either. I mean, you could say, look how high octane and how good that LSU offense was at throwing the football in 2023. And I'm like, they threw for 338 yards a game. That's a lot of yards. LSU this year threw for 315, and they lost, 4 games this year? They threw for a ton of yards. I don't really care about the total yards, Sean. I care about in 2023, they averaged 10.7 yards a catch. And in 2024, they averaged 7.7 yards per attempt. And in 2022, they averaged 7.9. It's about the efficiency and the big play nature of it. I mean, look, in Georgia or LSU in 2023 only threw 411 passes, Sean. That is not a lot of attempts per game. That is 31.6 attempts per game. That's what LSU threw in 2023 with Mike Denbrock. Notre Dame this year with Riley Leonard was at 27.8. That's only like 3.4 more passes per game than what Notre Dame threw this year. So it doesn't have to be a 40 pass per game team. I don't want to see Notre Dame look like 2024 LSU where they threw the ball 41 times a game. I want them to be more around where LSU was in 2023 from a structure standpoint. Now, they're not going to throw the ball the same number of times LSU did and throw for 338 yards a game because they don't have Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. It's not what I'm asking for. So instead of 10.7 yards per attempt, give me 8.7, 8.9, 9.0 on those same number of attempts. You'll throw for probably 40 or 50 fewer yards, maybe 60 fewer yards, but you're going to be efficient, but you're going to be a way more dynamic running team than what LSU was in 2023, and you're going to be way better on defense than LSU was in 2023. So I don't need a remodel or a remake of the 23 LSU offense. I need a version of that from an efficiency standpoint that and an explosiveness standpoint that complements your defense and your run game effectively. If Notre Dame goes out there this year and only throws for 260 yards a game, but they're averaging better than 8.7 yards per attempt, they're going to be a very hard team to beat. Very hard team to beat. As long as the defense keeps doing what it's doing and the run game keeps doing what it's doing. If you throw for 250 yards a game, or even 240 yards a game this year, Sean, but you're averaging over 8.5 yards per attempt, then you're going to be a way better offense than you were last year. So it's not about the yards. You've got to be more efficient and you've got to be more explosive throwing the football. That's what I hope Marcus Freeman learned from that Ohio State game. And if that's what they learn, then hey, I can live with that. I can absolutely live with that. And again, I don't care about the volume of yards. I don't care about any of that stuff. Ohio State this past year averaged 263 passing yards per game. That's it. Ohio State against Notre Dame only passed for 231 yards. They were not throwing the ball over the field, but Ohio State completed 81% of their passes. It's efficiency. And then they had balance in that game, Sean. They ran the ball on Notre Dame. They threw the ball on Notre Dame. It's whatever Notre Dame tried to take away, Ohio State had an answer for them. Hey, you want to come and blitz us and take our throwing game? Cool. We're going to run it up inside of you, and we're going to gash you with some big plays in the run game. Cool. Let's do it. And that's what it comes down to, Sean, is you got to be efficient and explosive. And that's exactly what Notre Dame was in the second half of that game against the first team Ohio State defense. We talk about they called off the dogs. They did offensively. They didn't defensively. And Notre Dame was able to go out there and throw all over them, but then they had lost the ability to be balanced because they were behind so much. But you did show that you can be explosive throwing the football. You did show that you have playmakers, that you don't have to be wide open all the time now to make plays, which in the past at Notre Dame, they had to be open to make plays because they weren't going to win making the tough plays. They didn't have receivers that could do to Caleb Downs what Jaden Greathouse did in past years. They didn't have receivers that could make one-handed touchdown catches with the guy draped on his other side like he did against Jordan Hancock in the national title game. They have that now. They didn't have guys who could make the third nine. I mean, they had guys who could win off the line of scrimmage and get a guy to fall down with a really good move and the safety comes over and takes a bad angle. And they've had guys who can do that. They haven't had guys who can make that third and 9 post back shoulder catch that he made in that moment. That's what they've lacked. And that's what they lacked a lot of the season, the regular season. And this is what we talked about all last year. Is when you have those opportunities, you've got to make those plays. Bo can't have the drops he had. Jaden can't have the drops he had. Riley had to do a better job of getting the receivers the ball in some of those situations. But you missed too many of those opportunities last year in the throwing game. You have to be more effective in the throwing game. I hope that's what he took away from this, because Ohio State didn't come out and throw the ball 45 times and never run it. They were balanced. Only threw the ball 21 times or 23 times in that game. Was it 23? Hold on a second. It was 21 times. That's it. They only threw the ball 33 times against Texas, only threw the ball 26 times against Oregon. I mean, if you look at it, Shaun, if you look at the last from Nebraska to the end of the season, the Michigan for Ohio State, the two games they threw the ball the most, the exception of Penn State, but the two games they threw the ball the most were their two lowest scoring games outside of the Penn State game in their last 9 games. Michigan and Texas. So only scored 21 offensive points against Texas. That's it. So it's not about volume. It's about efficiency and explosiveness. What I've been saying for years, be efficient and explosive. And at that point in time, I don't care what your numbers are at the end of the year. If your efficiency numbers are good and your big play ratio is good, I don't really care if it's 240 yards a game or 340 yards a game. With the way that they can run the football, they're going to be really dynamic on offense. And that's the final missing piece, is that part right there. And I don't know that they have the talent at receiver to go out there and throw the way that Ohio State did last year. But I don't think Ohio State had the offensive line last year that Notre Dame will have this year to run the ball the way that Notre Dame ran the ball. So it's that happy medium. And that's what I hope the lesson that he took away from this season is. Yeah. So that's going to do it for this part of the show. We do have one more segment coming up that we'll get to. We'll talk a little college football here, folks. But before we go, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Give us a 5-star review if you're listening on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. But as always, the best way to support what we're doing here at Irish Breakdown, on top of listening to our show every day, is to make sure you sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Shaun has had a ton of great recruiting content up lately. A lot of good intel pieces, Shaun. I kind of chuckle and, hey, did you see the crystal ball? And I'm like, if you were on the message board, you'd have known that like 4 days ago. But hey, it's good news. It's great news. That's awesome. So that's the reason you want to be on the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com.